Top 5 rock bands Paul McCartney hated the most, when people think of Paul McCartney, they picture Th. Cute Beatle with the catchy bass lines and a boyish grin. The songwriter of Yesterday is a culture icon who helped change the way popular music was made. But underneath the nightgown and happy exterior is a man who has strong feelings about the musicians who came before him. Throughout his career, Sir Paul has kept up a mostly diplomatic public image. However, people who knew him well have seen times when his polite exterior fell apart, showing harsh criticism of bands that didn't meet his exact standards. When Paul talks about music, he can be very honest. Dennis Lane, the former guitarist for Wings, said in a rare 2018 interview that may come. "It's kind of between Paul and me. It was always a friendly game, like, can you come up with something or can I?" He's not afraid to say what he really wants and doesn't want behind closed doors. From angry arguments during the British invasion to dismissive remarks about punk rockers who questioned his musical legacy, McCartney's private thoughts on certain artists show a competitive side that casual fans rarely see. His musical fights weren't just over personal issues, they were over important things like artistic direction, songwriting philosophy, and what rock music should stand for in the end. Today we're going to talk about the 6 bands that Paul McCartney couldn't stand, and why even some of the biggest names in music got the cute Beatles not-so-cute treatment. The 6th Rolling Stone review. The Rock and Roll Stone. The feud between the Beatles and the Stones shaped a generation, but fans didn't see how personal it got behind the scenes, even though the bands kept up a friendly front in public. McCartney has made sly digs at the Stones many times during his career. "I've always thought the Rolling Stones were a blues cover band that got lucky," McCartney is said to have told producer George Martin during a late-night Abbey Road session in 1968. Even though it never made the news, Paul's feelings have been shared in more subdued ways over the years. When asked by The New Yorker in 2021, McCartney couldn't help but say, "I don't know if I should say it, but they're a blues cover band. That's kind of what the Stones are. I think our net was a bit bigger than theirs." Mick Jagger quickly replied, calling the Beatles a 4-piece band with one drummer and making fun of the fact that the Stones were still packing stadiums. What Paul thought about the Stones' copied nature seems to be what made him dislike it. Peter Brown, a former executive at Apple Records, said, "Paul always felt the Stones were following in their footsteps by putting out similar album ideas months after the Beatles had already done that." Even more telling was McCartney's response when John Lennon briefly thought about producing a Stones record in 1969. Jeff Emmerich, a studio engineer, says that Paul was clearly annoyed and asked John why he would waste his time working with them when the Beatles had other projects that needed his attention. Even though McCartney has sometimes said nice things about certain Stone songs, the tension between the two artists has never really gone away. In 2016, Rolling Stone magazine asked about the competition. Paul's polite answer still had an edge to it. "They're a great band, but they're not the Beatles, are they?" The Sex. There are 2 types of pistols. Paul McCartney didn't like any other style of music, but punk rock really got to him. And no band showed that defiance better than the Sex Pistols. When the Anarchic Foursome came out in 1976 with their raw, angry sound and anti-establishment message, McCartney was said to be furious that they were rejecting everything he had worked hard to create. John Eastman, Linda McCartney's brother, said in a rare interview in 2003 that Paul thought their music hurt his ears. He also said that Paul couldn't understand why anyone would be happy about not being able to play their instruments properly. The feeling went both ways. When "God Save the Queen" by the Sex Pistols was climbing the charts, "Mull of Canire" by McCartney was also doing well. Not Johnny Rotten, it was John Lydon who openly called Paul a dinosaur who stood for everything punk stood against. What really annoyed McCartney wasn't their music, but how they attacked his legacy. Denny Swell, the drummer for the band Wings, says that Paul was especially hurt when he heard that the Pistols were using Beatles posters as targets during training. Even though he tried to laugh it off, you could tell it really hurt him. Sewell remembered that when both bands were recording in neighboring studios at London's Error facility in early 1977, things got really tense. Studio manager Dave Harris remembered that Paul made a friendly move to introduce himself, and Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts. McCartney turned away from them and never spoke to them again. After many years, McCartney would reluctantly agree that the punk movement had made music better, but he never really liked the Sex Pistols. Paul said in a 2016 BBC interview, "Not really my cup of tea," when asked about the band. The tightness in his voice told you everything you needed to know about how he really felt. For springs during the Brit Oasis pop craze of the 1990s, Oasis became known as self-proclaimed Beatles followers, with Noel Gallagher speaking out in favor of McCartney's songwriting. You might think that Paul would feel good about this praise, but it seems that it had the opposite effect when they were not together. McCartney's longtime publicist Jeff Baker said that Paul found their Beatles fascination annoying and almost insulting. His life's work seemed like it was being boiled down to a few copied chords and old tunes. What really annoyed McCartney about Oasis was their rude behavior and what he thought was copied music. Paul is said to have told George Martin at a private dinner in 1997, "They've got the swagger right, but where's the innovation? We didn't just copy our heroes, we transformed them." The aggressiveness of the Gallagher brothers made things more tense. There was a time in 1996 when Noel said that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles. McCartney was very angry. According to Philip Norman Paul, a biographer of the Beatles, Paul thought these comparisons were silly and secretly thought of the band as cocky newcomers with half the talent and twice the ego. When both McCartney and Oasis were getting awards at the 200Q Awards, it was a very awkward situation. It was said that Paul was surprisingly nice to Liam Gallagher when he asked for an autograph backstage. One witness said McCartney was polite but clearly nervous during the whole thing. Over the years, Paul's position has become a little less firm, and he sometimes admitted that Oasis helped keep guitar music popular. People close to him say he never really got over how he felt about how they stole the Beatles sound without any shame. In a 2018 interview with GQ, McCartney was asked directly about Oasis and gave a very short answer. "Songs that are good wish they had their own voice. The Animals, we have 3 Monkees. Few bands have made McCartney laugh as much as the Monkees. Most people thought they were just harmless fun." According to Beatles assistant Alistair Taylor's memoir, Paul saw them as a cynical business takeover of everything the Beatles had started. Paul saw them as a plastic imitation, Taylor wrote. On the way to the studio, he would change the station whenever one of their songs came on. The Monkees' fake beginnings bothered McCartney a lot because he had spent years perfecting his skill in Hamburg clubs before he became famous. Paul is said to have said, "They're making a mockery of what we built," during an angry argument with Brian Epstein in 1967. For players who look like a band, it hurts feelings. After Sgt. Pepper was freed, the stress rose when the TV show The Monkees started to include psychedelic elements. Harrison said that McCartney thought this was obvious theft and that Paul would be very angry about it. He'd add, "They're following our blueprint without doing any of the work." A very awkward moment happened at a party in Los Angeles in 1968 when McCartney allegedly turned down Mickey Dolenz by leaving in the middle of a conversation. Dolenz later said, "I don't think he ever accepted us as real musicians." Even though the Monkees finally fought for creative control and became a real band, McCartney's view never changed completely. In an interview in 2011, he was asked about them, and his polite answer still had a clear edge to it. They had some catchy songs, but they weren't the Beatles, were they? The Bee Gees had huge success during the disco era in the late 1970s, at the same time that McCartney's career after the Wings was slowing down. This happened at a time that made Paul angry at the Gibb brothers, according to people who know him. Paul was caught off guard by disco, director Chris Thomas said. It was these three brothers selling more records all of a sudden than the Beatles ever did with Saturday Night Fever, and he was angry. McCartney reportedly got angry because he thought the Bee Gees had gone from sounding like the Beatles to becoming disco stars. Lawrence Ubayer, the guitarist for Wings, says that Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and mumble something about how they had given up their original sound for money. When both bands were recording at the same Miami studio in 1979, the rivalry got worse. Studio manager Tony Bongiovi remembers that Paul would plan his sessions so that he wouldn't run into them. He looked stressed when someone told him that the Bee Gees had broken another record. McCartney was especially annoyed by the praise they got from critics. When the Bee Gees were called great songwriters after reinventing themselves for disco, Paul is said to have told his band members, "They're using the same three chords as everyone else. They only sped them up and added a drum machine." Paul has never openly attacked the Bee Gees, but the fact that he doesn't include them when talking about important artists says a lot. Even in 2001, when Maurice Gibbs died, McCartney's statement was very short and impersonal compared to other artists' touching tributes. This suggests that the competitive scars never fully healed. The Boys from the Beach. One of the Beach Boys' the most intense musical competition Paul McCartney ever had wasn't with punk rockers or stadium rock bands. It was with the Beach Boys, who were the pioneers of America's sunshine pop music. McCartney and Wilson fell in love with each other at first, but their friendship turned into a creative feud that music experts still talk about today. Famous director Phil Spector said, "Paul and Brian were like two chess grandmasters. Each move one made, the other had to win." They began as friends, but it quickly turned into an addiction for both of them. The feud began when McCartney heard Pet Sounds in 1966. George Martin, the producer of the Beatles, says that Paul was both motivated and threatened. He played it over and over again, thinking about each note. Then he'd say, "We need to go further than this." Which led straight to Sgt. Pepper. The broken relationship was really caused by the Forgotten Smile book. Wilson put Wilson's work on hold because he was having mental health issues, and McCartney was said to be rude. The Beatles wrote that Paul told Paul, "If you can't finish what you start, you shouldn't be in this business. We push through no matter what." At a terrible dinner party at Brian Wilson's house in 1967, things got really heated. McCartney is said to have said that some Beach Boys songs were too simple and that their harmonies were too predictable. Dennis Wilson, Beach Boys drummer, says Paul thought he had given good comments when he left. He didn't talk for days after that. Over many years, the rivalry turned into a darker conflict. When asked about the Beach Boys' effect in an interview in 1993, McCartney downplayed it in a very public way. "They had beautiful harmony, but I think people say too much about how much they changed our lives. We were well on our way already." Even when talking about God Only Knows and a song he called "Perfect," in the last few years McCartney can't help but add qualifiers like "for American pop music" or "of that period," which shows that he still has a competitive edge after all this time. History buff and Beach Boys fan David Leaf said, "Paul admires Brian's work, but he'll never fully admit how hard it pushed him. That would mean accepting that someone else shaped the Beatles. Here is our list of the 6 bands that Paul McCartney didn't like. Even music stars have a musical enemy, whether it's a creative rivalry or a personality clash. What do you think about these fights? Did anything surprise you? Leave your thoughts in the box below. Click the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the past of rock music if you liked this. Click the bell to make sure you don't miss our weekly posts.